And this is not the end of the discussion on the theme. I think this is the beginning. It can never end. Nationalism is the most talked about, written about, researched concept. It is understood as an ideology, as a manifesto, a theory, a methodology, and a political program. Yet, there are no disagreements are continuing. The more we work, the more we write on nationalism, the more disagreements we create. Ethno-nationalism is a spatial consciousness. It is a kind of territorialization of memories. The sense of identity and national consciousness is a complex in our region and in other regions, which are borderlands, where people have transnational past. India is still a nation in the making, so do the identities constituting it. The debate is whether regional identities are oppositional to nationalism, whether they employ dualistic vocabulary and juxtapose regionalism and nationalism as distinct processes. Can there be a negotiation between the segmented identities and a pan-Indian nationalism? To me, answer lies in the finding out the possibility of connecting the regional and the national, as Sanjeev Barua has done in his work on Assam. He has tried to connect Assamese sub-nationalism as a part of Indian nationalism. There is a very good article by him where he picks up Bhupen Hazarika's work and try to analyze Assamese sub-nationalism. I think this will create a possibility of treating regional aspirations as multiple belongings, and thus Indian nation is produced at various levels of society. Instead of contradicting the regionalism and the local aspirations can be a connect to the nationalism. At the base of the identity concerns of Nepali-speaking Indians lies the question of belonging and non-belonging. A political anxiety of being accepted or being rejected. This brings us to the question of being recognized, unrecognized, and sometimes misrecognized. To know who am I and how do others know me? Here I would like to quote Charles Taylor. My discovering my own identities does not mean that I work out this in isolation, but that I negotiate through dialogue. My own identity depends on my ideological relation with others. Thus, there is a need to communicate, to negotiate, and connect the micro, small narratives to the larger, macro, grand narratives. This is an area where I feel much research work needs to be carried out. Unless we are able to connect with others, we'll be isolated and we'll be misread, sometimes misrecognized. The word Nepali is a very connotative word. Nepali in Nepal means a citizenship. He or she may be a say Bengali or a Punjabi or a Tharu or a Rai or a Gurung or Limbu, whoever a person is, irrespective of his language, culture, religion, a citizen in Nepal is a Nepali. But that's not the case in India. Here, Nepali refers to a community, a social groupings who speak Nepali. This identity is a dynamic process. Identity is a dynamic process in which churning takes place regularly. Through a historical process of what we are, there is a shift to what we are, what we were, and there is a shift to what we are, and there will be an imagining shift to what we will be. And this goes on as a continuing process. And in case of Nepali-speaking Indians, from a homogeneous identity discourse, Nepali India is now a heterogeneous identity discourse within which distinct and various cultures negotiate with each other through their exchanges, interactions, and expressions. And Nepali language, which is a lingua franca, becomes a vehicle to this process. It is through this language that the whole process churning out takes place. This is often a question, whose language is Nepali? Nepali belongs to whom? To me, it is a language of a hybrid identity with a mixture of Tibeto-Burman and Indo-Aryan and even Sino-Tibetan language groups. We cannot draw parallels with Nepal, though the history may have some influence. The language here in India and particularly in Darjeeling region actually has been developed more by Tibeto-Burman groups than Indo-Aryan groups. If you look at the list of the writers, it is easily evident. Therefore, whenever we talk about identity concerns of Indian Nepalis, I think knowledge and proper learning of Nepali, development of Nepali language and Nepali literature and Nepali culture in that, the way that is developed in Darjeeling and its adjacent areas is very important. Without proper understanding of the development of Nepali language and Nepali history in Darjeeling, it is very difficult to actually talk about identity. One important aspect I feel is that our area, this area belongs to borderland. The area has an entangled history. And you know, entangled history is a recent trend which is being used in history. So we have to think about entangled history. We have to think about borderland academics, borderland studies. The border effect is very great. This is an area where culture is liminal. This is an area where culture is permeable, and therefore there is a swing. In Nepali, we call it lingeping. So culture is like that. And in this kind of a culture, it is very difficult to see the history of this place splitting from Nepal history, Sikkim history, and Bhutanese history. And therefore, since our history is entangled with these areas, with this region, and particularly with Nepal, our concern, our cultural connection with Nepal cannot be taken as our belongingness to Nepal. It is an accepted fact, you see. So to me, like, you know, I don't mind and I don't hesitate to say that cultural root is in Nepal, but that I am an Indian and I have a history of more than 200 years in India. If you look at today, for example, in America, for example, vice president, the post of vice president ticket has been given to Kamala Das, an Indian origin. And all Indians are proud that some of the top political leaders in America and even in England today, the Home Minister belongs to a person of Indian origin. And Indian people, and even those diaspora, are proud of coming from Indian origin. So the discourse also, the Nepali identity discourse also includes the relationship with Nepal. Recently, when there was some skirmishes between India and Indo-Nepal relationship, there were many journalists, many scholars who were pointing out about 1950 Nepal Treaty. Therefore, whenever we talk about Nepali identity in India as Indian national, it is a very, very sensitive, and we have to be very careful in understanding and reading this identity question, identity issue. And in this understanding of Nepali literature, the development of Nepali language and Nepali culture, the intermixing and the hybridness of Darjeeling people is very important. With these words, I again welcome you all in this webinar, and particularly our speakers, Dr. Binaya Sundas and Dr. Binu Sundas. I hope we will deliberate this issue with clear objective in mind as an academic people and not engage in personalizing or sensationalizing the issue. Let us be very academic and try to understand these topics objectively. And I hope the learned scholars will enlighten us on this program. With these words, thank you very much, and over to Yojana Khadka for further program. Thank you.
Uh, Thank you so much, sir. Uh, due to technical problem, hello, am I
Yes,
audible?
carry on.
Uh, uh, yes, due to
Yes,
technical
Rita.
problem, we could not like formally welcome our guests. So I would like to do now. Good evening, everyone. So I, Richa Ali from Department of Sociology, Kalimpong College, would like to welcome our Honorable Principal Sir, Dr. R.P. Dhakal, our respected resource person for today's talk, Dr. Binayak Sundas, Assistant Professor, Center for Himalayan Studies, University of North Bengal, Dr. Binu Sundas, Assistant Professor, Department of Sociology, Miranda House, University of Delhi, Dr. Tikendra K. Chetri, Department of Peace and Conflict Studies, Sikkim Universities. I would like to welcome our respected teachers and all the participants. Today, one day national level webinar on nationalism, people and protest, a perspective from Himalayan region is jointly organized by Department of Political Science and Sociology of Kalimpong College. We hope everyone will enjoy and find this webinar interesting. Now, I would like to hand over to Ms. Reshma Pradhan to introduce our first speaker. Over to you, Reshma.
Good evening, everyone. I am Rishma Pradhan, Assistant Professor, Department of Political Science, Kalimpong College. First of all, I would like to extend my warm gratitude to all the dignitaries who are with us in this one-day national webinar on the theme Nationalism, People and Protest, Perspective from Himalaya Region, jointly organized by the Department of Political Science and Department of Sociology, Kalimpong College. So moving ahead towards the first technical session, for this session, we have with us the most valued and eminent resource person, Dr. Binayak Sundas, Assistant Professor, Center for Himalayan Studies, University of North Bengal. And sir's topic for today's deliberation is a study for the nation creation of the Nepali national narrative in Darjeeling. So before Sir proceed with his presentation, I will take the privilege to accord you all with a brief introduction of Dr. Binayak Sundas sir. Dr. Binayak Sundas sir has done his graduation from St. Stephen College, University of Delhi. He completed his MA, MPhil and PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He is a profound historian and researcher. His area of research interest includes history of Nepal and Eastern Himalaya. He has contributed numerous articles in reputed international and national journals. Apart from this, he has also published several books and chapters. Also, he has presented papers in international and national seminars. Currently, he is associated with the University of North Bengal as an assistant professor in the Department of Center for Himalayan Studies. Thank you. Now, I would like to invite Sir Binayak Sundas to begin his presentation. Sir, over to you.
Thank you so much, Reshma. Um, I will have to correct you on one issue. I don't think I'm a very reputed historian or historian at all. And I definitely haven't written any books as of yet. I plan to, and I'm in the process of writing one. Usually, the more chupchap baste and let you all believe that I've written a book, but there are so many scholars here that I don't think I'm going to let sort of chupchap baste or let that compliment slide over. Uh, to those of you all who are wondering, yes, Binu Sundas and Binayak Sundas, we are related. So that just letting that cat out of the bag, so to speak. Um, many years ago, I as a young scholar, and those of you who are not familiar with the academic sort of how the academic world functions, there is sort of a hierarchy of sorts. And many years ago, when I was a young scholar, I like to believe I'm still a young scholar, but then when I was still a student, I we were invited by Heidelberg University for a conference that was to be held here in Kalimpong at Himalaya Hotel. And it was at that particular time that I had the opportunity of meeting Rajendra Rakal sir, as well as Bharat Mani sir, who's present today. Um, in a very Gandhi-esque sort of a storyline, I was denied residence along with other scholars, international scholars, might I put, at the Himalaya Hotel, and I was asked to sort of look for my own lodgings elsewhere in the town, which I at that point thought was very rude. And I remember Rajendra Rakal sir also, when he heard about this, taking offense as well. And the next day, when we were allowed to present, we were only given 10 minutes. And when later the proceedings came out, we were not even told or informed. And that's the kind of sort of, hold that certain Western scholars have over the production of knowledge in our area. And I remember Dhakal sir telling me that, and even Bharatmani sir telling me that we will one day organize a conference that will represent the local voices, will represent local scholars. And of course, this would have happened a long time back if people like us weren't busy with our own PhDs, and we sort of did not give enough what shall we say, kind of support to Dhakal sir and Manipur sir to conduct this sooner. But anyways, we are here now. Uh, Today, just to take a little bit from what Dhakal sir was mentioning, I just like to mention the fact that the problem with Himalayan history as such is the parcelization of history into these various sort of watertight compartments known as uh, sorry, can you all hear me? Uh, can you all hear me now?
Yes, Binaya, we all can hear you. Can carry on.
Uh, yeah. So so the problem is the parcelization of history into these various nation states. The history of the Himalayas partialized into these nation states, where the history of, say, Nepal would end at the border, and would not look into any other matters, into what they consider to be outside their dominions, and the history of Bhutan would similarly take place in a similar manner. What that does is it does not encompass the very complicated historical trajectory of this particular region, right? And this is perhaps a very modernist tragedy, so to speak, that with what would be termed as what sort of somebody like Anthony D. Smith would call limiting history in finite space and time. uh, One of the many pitfalls of following the nation state's history, of manner of doing history, is sort of getting limited by these national boundaries. Otherwise, how can you understand the history of, I forget the Nepali or the Gorkha dynamics, just the history of Kalimpong as a region, and I am in Kalimpong, by the way, at the moment. So forgive me if the light goes away. So how can you understand Kalimpong minus, say, Tibet or Bhutan, or what is Tibet today, Tibet, or what is today Bhutan, or what is today Eastern Nepal? I mean, it's impossible, right? And that is actually what we are trying to do at the Center for Himalayan Studies at the moment, is that we are trying to evolve a concept of a, a Himalayan history that goes beyond the confines of the nation states, and nation states that have come very recently. Uh, I'm sure most of you all know, but Nepal does not exist until 1930s. The term Nepal was only used to denote the valley of Kathmandu. I've said this several times before. The name for that state was Gorkha Samrajya, or rather the Gorkha Empire. Uh, the kind of Nepal that only becomes after 1951. Uh, so I, again, I don't know what to do. I'm speaking as close to the mic as I can. Uh, so if you can't hear me, please bear with me. Or if I mean, I don't know what else to do. Anyhow, to begin with my lecture, and I would really request the organizers to give me a little bit of an extra time, uh, because come on, we are all at home, so I guess a little bit of going beyond the timeline shouldn't hurt. Uh, Today I'll be speaking on the creation of a narrative, the creation of a nationalist narrative. And here I don't mean the creation of either Indian Nepali or Nepal Nepali. I would like to argue that in the period that I'm speaking of, we are speaking of a period where the nation had not evolved into this complicated concepts, and the nation state itself hasn't evolved. So please bear that in mind. I don't mean to say anything political at the present moment. Anyhow, uh, you know, it's often said that nation is a painting that is brought to life on the canvas of history. The need to place sort of the origins of the nation in antiquity is a relatively well-known phenomenon. As such, this by itself should place history in a position of power as far as the nation's sort of imagination is concerned. History's role in nation building, of course, goes far beyond being a simple sort of a backdrop where the nation's origins are placed. It defines the very imagination of the nation. The emergence of a nation is dependent on how a certain space is sort of imagined, um, uh, you know, uh, and how through a coherent narrative, an attribution of meanings to the social, cultural, political, economic, and in many cases, religious landscape, that place that space becomes a place. And this place, when it is bound together by a coherent story that happens to a certain time span, creates a nation. And I mean nation, let's not fall into the ethno-symbolist trap where they cannot differentiate between a nation and a nation state. It's very important to know the difference. It's something that Rajiv Bhargava, people, scholars, and I'm a bit partial towards the scholars from GNU, people like Sudipta Kaviraj, etc. What they mentioned about, how the narrative itself changes when it goes from the phase of being a narrative for a nation and then becoming a narrative for a nation state, right? History in that sense, in that context, is a contested space where several forces within the nation, or rather the nation state, is or within in regions within the nation state is always struggling to own the narrative. You see the manner in which nationalism is shaped, how certain national figures are created, and how the nation itself is imagined is dependent on how a certain historical narrative is structured. And it is not perhaps then surprising why, when a new group, and you know which group I am referring to, when it comes to power in a modern nation state, very often history becomes one of the first sort of this, one of the first spaces that is attempted to be owned and then altered. No need to take names, I guess. And this contest and this sort of dispute goes far beyond the realm of academia and of texts. Take for example what Martin Heisler says in the introduction, Political Currency of the Past, History, Memory, and Identity. He mentions the fact that between the conception and writing of that particular volume, for which he was writing the introduction, a writer and editor was assassinated, a scholar was exiled, a prime minister's resignation was hastened, parliamentarians accused each other of treason, right? And the writers of that particular volume were threatened, and all of this happened because of specific disagreement with how past or certain aspects of the past was to be sort of portrayed. Um, uh, a much more sort of a recent example to this debate is as you all know, the Ayodhya conflict, where, or rather the Ayodhya temple construction, where the whole host of narratives is challenged here and there, and then it goes to the court to decide what kind of narrative is accepted, or even the vilification of the Delhi sultans and Mughal emperors. As you can see, that is happening at the present moment. There is a very specific reason why that happens, right? As Maria Greva would argue, that this is, this is an act of political instrumentalization of the past. One must not get in, sort of misunderstand this as a modern phenomenon, though. Anthony D. Smith, in a very sort of a typical ethno-symbolist tradition, claims that this idea of a past, or of a shared past, and past being important, is not just specific to a nation or that of a nation state. It's also something that is very intrinsic to political formations or social political formations that came before the formation of nations, and what he defines as the ethne, right? But this creation of a certain kind of histories actually began after the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, the rise of nation states, when it was necessary to sort of create certain kinds of dramatic and narratable events of the past that would help a nation define its identity. And the plot, and I literally use the term plot, the plot of that particular narrative would speak of a nation's rise, to speak of a nation's decline, because it wasn't just enough to talk about a rise. It's also important to talk about decline and then ultimate rebirth through time. And all of these and the journey of a particular nation, a journey of that particular nation was sort of represented through exemplary events, right? Lives of great leaders and figures and their ideas, and these myths and heroes would sort of create a very, very significant role in creating the national community, which was then used to sort of legitimize the political leaders of the present, right? And in doing so would one would sort of create a successive or what could be termed as the pantheon of heroes or national heroes. And this is something we see even in India. You can see the whole contest between which sort of national hero needs to be vilified, and unfortunately Nehru seems to these days to find the wrong end of the stick, and which heroes are then to be sort of exalted and without sort of not just exalted, but need or are in the need of saving from actual historical events, because they may not portray them in the correct way. And all of these representation of narratives actually goes beyond historical text, to tell you the truth. The various actors, and I would like you all to think about it as I explain my what I mean to say in the specific context of Darjeeling and Kalimpong, and to a certain extent of Nepal, that it isn't just the historical text that normal makes the narrative normative. It's also the fact that there are various actors like local elites, writers, artists, politicians, filmmakers, novelists, etc., who are all involved in this sort of monumentization of the nation, and giving it historical justification here by confirming the historical narrative. And though it is tempting perhaps to suggest that this is something that only happens in the West. For example, when I sent in my recent article, Reshma was saying that I've actually written in a lot of international reputed journals. That's not true. I've written in a few of them, and most of them have been a real pain to sort of get them approved because of this whole peer review system. And in a recent peer review system, somebody had written back to me when I was mentioning all of this, that this is what you're talking about is a very Western concept, because there is sort of an exotization of the concept of indigenous these days. Please use your earphones. If you want me to use my earphones, you guys will have to wait, because I'll have to go get my earphones. Can you all wait for 2 minutes? I'll just get my earphones. Right? Just a second. Huh? Priyanka? No, no, no. Somebody's saying they can't hear me. They can't hear me. All right, guys. So now that I'm using the earphones, I hope I'm more audible. Guys, I mean, apart from this, there's really nothing I can do. So I'd really request you not to sort of, tell me anything in which it really sort of breaks the flow. Please don't take this personally. Uh, where was I? See, this tends to happen. Yeah. So, in the recent sort of an article I had submitted, the peer review sort of came back and the person said that whatever you're talking about is mostly in context of Western nations, but that's not true. Because of the fact that while these processes, uh, um, you know, began in Europe, uh, they found its resonance everywhere, uh, from Zimbabwe uh, to say a place like to India during its partition. As a matter of fact, Rajiv Bhargava mentions about how the historical traditions that developed in the post-partition South Asia demonstrates how the two nation states, India and Pakistan, chose to represent a certain historical narrative leading up to partition in 1947. Um, because in Pakistan, the narrative suggested that the partition was important. That it was not possible for Muslims to live within a Hindu majority India, whereas in India, partition was considered to be a tragedy. And it wasn't just this; it was also the fact that uh, uh, which Mughal ruler was to be sort of eulogized either in India or in Pakistan. In Pakistan, it was always Aurangzeb because he was considered to be a defender of Islam, whereas Akbar was seen to be sort of a heretic, so to speak. And in India, because Akbar represented what one might call the secular ideals of Nehru and the Congress, he was seen as the ideal ruler. So this is the manner in which political narratives are, find resonance everywhere. Even in uh, sort of third world or rather in non-European countries. Uh, it's interesting just to mention what Sudipta Kaviraj says, and in this case, what I'm about to mention about the Nepali national narrative. He mentions about how Sudipta Kaviraj mentions about how the narrative actually evolves and it responds to the current political needs, whether of the nation or of the nation state. That once India got its independence, the narrative had to evolve because it needed to suit the requirements of the nation that had found the state now. Anyhow, in context of the Nepali national history, now let me just begin by saying this. When I place the origins of the Nepali historical narrative to early 20th century, I don't mean to say that the earlier phase did not have an idea of history. As a matter of fact, if you were to believe Rabindranath Tagore, then any moment a community shows a concern of the past as a guiding spirit to the future, then a sense of historical consciousness has already evolved. And it's fair to say that there is no society that is sort of historical. But in the 19th century, there were sort of attempts to write a certain kind of history where space and place were finite, in the sense that if you look at the Vanshavalis or even of the Limbu Mundums, space and place are not finite, both in the context of the oral traditions such as the Raj Vanshawali as well as the Gupta Vanshawali.
space and place are not at all finite. So once the 19th century comes about, we have a lot of sort of history being written about a finite space, like history of Nepal, history of Sikkim, history of so and so and so and so forth, where it's getting partialized. And it derives a lot from the rise of Enlightenment historiography that's taking place at the moment in Europe. Um, you also remember the fact that most of the people who are writing these histories are Europeans. Uh, the the nationalist rise of the nationalist school of thought derives a lot from the romantic historiography, where people like Walter Scott writing the history of Scotland, and just to tell you how important narratives are, Walter Scott is even considered to be the person who invented Scotland. Not to say that the political structure known as Scotland didn't exist before that, but the manner in which certain ideas of Scotland exist, the bagpipes, the whole ideas of clans, and so on and so forth, was invented in the writings of Walter Scott, and that is how powerful narratives can be. In case uh, of the Nepali national narrative, uh, it was invented as Pratish Onka, one of my sort of favorite historians, and the person who's written sort of genre-defining work known as the Creating a Brave Nepali Nation and British India, the Rhetorical Jati Improvement, and the discovery of Bhanubhakta and the writing of Beer history. He mentions the fact that that particular nationalist narrative, which he calls the Beer Itihas, was created in the confines of Darjeeling by the Nepali proto-middle class, which was influenced by colonial education and the various sort of nationalist narratives that were taking place elsewhere in British India. Just to sort of fast forward, this particular nationalist narrative was the same nationalist narrative that the Nepali nation state took over in 1951. This became, the Nepali national history, rather the history of the of Nepali nation state post 1951. I mean, it's a bit controversial in Nepal, especially to suggest this, to tell them that that the origins of that particular national narrative, is actually originated in a place outside of Darjeeling, outside of Nepal. But we will get, the reasons, the various sort of complications and all of that, we'll get to that in a while. Now, you see, because in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, a discourse of self-improvement that was designed broadly around 2 themes of general education and the progress of the Gorkha sort of language. And remember, then it was known as Gorkha language. The term Nepali hasn't become the normative term that to be used. I don't want to get into how the language is known as Kaskura from, going right back into the Samrajya, and then coming to how, Jang Bahadur renamed it as Gorkhali in 1850, and then how the British recorded it as Nepali. I think these things are known to you all, and I wouldn't like to get into this in detail. So you had, these 2 broad themes where you were talking about of general progress. I'm sorry, there's literally nothing more I can do now. तिम्रो छेउमा आएर बोल्यो भने मात्रै हो. The progress of the Gorkha language was generated from, and these 2 aspects were generated from both from Benares, initially from Benares by a small group of quote unquote Nepalis, and it found a larger sort of a force and a sustained manner in sort of in Darjeeling by the early 1920s, as it became a very sort of an important site for the production of the rhetoric of improvement. Because in the mid 1920s, rhetoric was applied towards familiarizing with the what was termed as the Gorkha Jati to its own history. The need for the sort of the Jati to be remembered, or for the Jati to know its history, became more and more sort of the dominant sort of theme. Both, and the historical narrative was not just sort of political, but also literary. The Darjeeling-based Nepali language activists made a more sort of a decisive effort to rename the language as Nepali, right? And in the need to do so, they in many ways, and I use the term, created Bhanubhakta as a potent jati icon for this particular purpose. Now, this is not to suggest that he was not a historical figure or that Motiram Bhattacharya had sort of discovered him prior. But the use of the term creation, I do so in a very specific context of which I will get into much later, a little later. In the 1930s and the 1940s, these Jati advocates rendered Nepali history in what is considered as the Bir mode of constructing the pantheon of heroes who were derived from certain concept of the unification, concept of Ekikaran. There was Balbhadra here in Darjeeling and Sikkim his Balbhadra Thapa, but in Nepal is Balbhadra Pual. The caste dynamics is something else that I can't get into. Uh, Anyhow, I'll have to skip a few. So, these the Nepali language is one of the essential elements of a unifying historical narrative, because that both the language as well as the unifying historical narrative was essential for the community to sort of for the community to develop the concept of an identity. Later, they would render that particular fact that that space that was known as the Gorkha Samrajya and then later as Nepal uh, was not colonized, and that allowed it to become to become Bir in a sense. It allowed it to become a concept of Bir, itihas. Sorry. Yeah. So the narrative initially that sort of took place in Banaras as well as in Darjeeling was based on this concept. And if you look into how the national plot emerges, typically emerges anywhere for a nation. This was a concept of a nationalist the concept of a national rebirth, so to speak. Because obviously this can't be the concept of the birth, because national history needs to place the origins of the nation far back into history than just say 10 to 20 years. So whatever was being discussed by initially by these scholars were a concept of rebirth, and if Bhanubhakta would be the representation of rebirth. In that case, there had to be a concept of a rise, there had to be a concept of a decline. And in that sense, the nationalist narrative already had a plot to sort of work with. To get into the sort of, to get into the details of how this sort of came about, one would like to get into the story of Parasmani Pradhan, one of the giants of Darjeeling-based Nepali language activists for much of the century, and who recounts that in 1915, as a 17-year-old ninth grade student in Government-run high school in Darjeeling, he was the secretary of a small organization in that school called the Hindi Sahitya Samaj, which also ran a small library. And when he proposed that the library should also hold some books in Gorkha, in what he referred to as the Gorkha Bhasa for certain students who use the language, the executive committee completely rejected the proposal. And it is said that Parasmani then resigned abruptly from that organization and began another organization that was called the Gorkha Sahitya Samaj, not Sammelan that happens later. And from there, he collected appropriate books and magazines sort of for it. And this is the time this is the particular juncture that Parasmani sort of identifies as one of his early efforts in the Darjeeling area to give a separate identity to what he would call the Nepali language. Around this time, Parasmani would also look into the fact that school curriculum uh, did not allow for students to sort of write the exams in Nepali, and while it allowed for Hindi, and Parasmani himself sort of being somebody who gave his matriculation in Hindi. Uh, it's a very popular story about how when a vice chancellor of Calcutta University had come on an observation to a press high school, Parasmani had presented him with a petition that was signed not just by himself, but by several other students, requesting that the university recognize the Nepali language in the same way that it recognized Hindi, Bangla, Urdu, and Tibetan. Upon hearing this, it said that the Bengali man who, and this is not to sort of vilify the Bengali in any way, just a man here. Uh, the Bengali man who was a lawyer and also a former student of the same school, it's, you know, in Nepali, how we say sutupe, told the vice chancellor that he was petitioning to be sort of included and given the same status as Hindi, Bangla, Urdu, and Tibetan, was a language that was spoken by coolies and kawadis, right? And as such, had not attained the right to be given the same status as, say, an Urdu or a Hindi or a Bengali. Uh, Now, here is where we need to sort of get into the details of what made this particular language the language of coolies and kabadis. And it is, in my opinion, a very, very, very important aspect of how the Nepali nationalist narrative actually evolves. Not just that, but how an entire understanding of the Nepali nation evolved, and how that, unfortunately, how that Nepali nation was later superimposed on a very, very complicated social structure in Nepal. Um, and the reason for this is quite simple. The reason for this is because the different kind of political formation that existed in the Gorkha Samrajya vis-a-vis what was taking place in a place like Darjeeling. Because, in Nepal, the terminology is usually the unification, or rather the Ekikaran narrative, but um, but here in but somebody like Kumar Pradhan argues for the concept of the Gorkha expansion, and that is possibly the more correct way to term what happened in the 18th century, how Nepal was actually created. It was the expansion of one particular state that went on to superimpose its opinions on everything from land rights to religious and moral understandings to social structure to almost everything, and how it superimposed all of these ideas in a group of people. Um, when the Gorkha expansion took place, the language that was spoken by the ruling class, which was Kaskura, became the dominant language. And how and why it happened is probably very self-explanatory to those of you who are familiar with how political hegemony, or rather social hegemony, is created. Uh, but in Darjeeling, the case was different, you see, and that's the whole point. In Darjeeling, Nepali, and this is what I think Rajendra sir was also trying to refer to, because of the commercial ventures known as plantations that came up, and the massive amount of migration that took place in the mid 19th century from the Gorkha Samrajya, and the reasons for migrations are everything from social oppressions to political oppressions, and in particular landed indebtedness, because the land, and this is what I actually work at, and the land rates the rates for land revenue just went over the roof. It was impossible to pay the land revenue, and it wasn't just the fact that there was high land revenue in the Gorkha Samraj, that Gorkha state for later on became Nepal, but it was also the fact that most of this land revenue was demanded in cash, and demanding a cash in a demonetized, because that term is very popular these days, demanding the tax in a demonetized economy where economy that is not monetized can create problems for the peasants, because now they need to cough up the money, the cash from somewhere, and the person who can give the cash is usually the sahukar. It's why even now when your parents are angry with you, they say "Kafka sahur." So because that's how the term is vilified. So because of these facts, and I wouldn't like to get into the land revenue structure of the Gora Samrajya, but sort of it's too complicated and too long. But whatever the case may be, it allowed for a large group of people to migrate to nearby, areas of what can be termed as British India, and some to Dehradun, some went to the northeast frontiers, and some went to Sikkim, and then to the Darjeeling plantation. Also, it should be remembered that when we talk about Nepali migration, please remember that it's not like all Nepalis migrated together. Various groups, like the Limbus, would migrate first because of the Limbu uprising. The Tamangs migrated later after the Tamang uprising was crushed. The Magas Gurungs sort of migrated because of the rising agrarian crisis. The Kamidame Sarpi, well, they had to migrate. Life was bad for them anyways. So these migrations allowed for a certain kind of situation to be created in the plantation areas in Darjeeling, where the language Nepali was not a dominant language imposed by the state. It was not the language of the ruling class, as it was in a place like Kathmandu, right? Here in Darjeeling, the language was a lingua franca, and it's not my sort of argument. This is more the argument of somebody like Kumar Pradhan. It's very well quoted in one of his works, Pailu Prahar, where he mentions about how the language was a lingua franca rather than the language of the dominant class. And it was far more easier in that case for this language to become a unifying force, or even for the concept of a unified community to come about. It was impossible to imagine this kind of a linguistic nationalism to arise in a place like Nepal, which is why Nepal had to borrow it in 1951 from what was taking place in that. I'll get to this in a much more sort of detailed manner a while later. So these are the reasons why that day when the Bengali man and whispered into the ears of the vice chancellor that it was, it's one of the reasons why that day the vice chancellor would sort of whisper. The Bengali man would whisper into the ears of the vice chancellor that because it literally was the lingua franca of all the communities were there, and for most of them it wasn't their first language any which ways. Now you had a situation where the need to standardize the language was felt by people like Kalimpong Pradhan, and later people like Dhajidhar Koirala, as well as Surya Bikram Gewal. Surya Bikram Gewal actually comes slightly later. I was just told by my wife that if I hold up the microphone like this, it might be more audible. So I hope I'm audible now. The only thing is, when and I'm sorry that if one of you all took offense to what I said a little while earlier, it's just that when you keep getting interrupted, it really breaks the flow. It's very difficult to sort of keep a strain of your thought. So I really apologize if I sounded rude a while ago. See, this is what happens. One tends to forget what I was saying. Anyway, the need to standardize the language as well, because it's not just enough for the language or for the community to have a rebirth. There's also a need to look at how that rebirth would take place, right? And standardization of the language was the first thing that was sort of attempted. And you have people like Parasmani Pradhan initially writing to somebody like Sarada Prasad Mukherjee, the principal of the Darbar High School, to contact Calcutta University on their behalf. And because of all these efforts, you do see that in 1918, the Calcutta Gazette announced that the Nepali language had been approved for study and examination for the metric level, the 10th grade. And the language then was known as Nepali, Pahari, and Khas Kura. After this, you have a plethora of, you had a plethora of, apologies, you had a plethora of various magazines that came out of both uh, of Banaras as well as in Darjeeling, magazines that were known as magazines such as Chandrika, Gorkhali, Upanyas, Tarangini, Sundari, etc. And I can't really get into the details. I think I'm soon sort of running short of time. But the point of the fact of the matter was this, that the proliferation of these of these magazines point to the fact that the language movement was achieving a certain amount of success, and it was creating a center point from where a concept of a Nepali jati was evolving. Now, the term jati is very, very important, or rather very tricky, not important, but rather tricky to sort of, to understand, because of the fact that uh, what the term jati meant in something such as the Mulki Ain of 1854 in Kathmandu, and what the jati began to mean in Darjeeling are two different things. You see, because here jati didn't mean caste. Here jati meant, and if this is from various readings of several works of both, of all of Surya Bhimkali and of Dharmendra Koirala, as well as of Parasmani Pradhan, where where you understand that the concept of jati was now being referred to as a concept of nation, mind you, not of nation state. And the concept of nation in itself wasn't yet well defined. It was still in the flux. One hadn't been able to sort of define it in complete senses. Anyhow, sorry. From there on in, the idea began that, or rather, the national linguistic movement began in earnest in 1970s. There was a need for a certain kind of a historical structuring, and one of and the nature of a nationalist narrative that was very popular at this point of time, not just in Darjeeling but elsewhere, among the Marathas, among the Punjabis, amongst among the Bengalis, etc., was the creation of iconic figures around whom the nationalist narrative would then sort of come together. And in this context, you had somebody like. This is not to say that, as I mentioned before, this is not to say that Bhanubhakta Acharya was not a historical figure. He was a historical figure. He did live at the time that in the mid 19th century within the Gorkha dominions, and he did write the Satkhand of Ramayana and all of that. And it's also true that somebody like Motiram Bhatta had sort of discovered his works, and in the words of his biographer, the biographer of Motiram Bhatta, uh, he discovered the Ramayana in one of the marriages that he had attended, and all of that is true, and it's also true that Motiram Bhatta had also expressed the fact that, sorry, I tend to forget things. Motiram Bhatta had also said that Bhanu Bhakta was one of the persons who was taking forward the idea of the Gorkha language further, but in nowhere in his writings does the concept of him turning up as a national, or rather is a as a jati icon ever evolves, or rather the question of him as a literary sort of national literary icon ever emerge in any of his writings. Now, for this, and in the need of a certain kind of a nationalist narrative that was emerging because of this nationalist linguistic nationalist movement taking place in Darjeeling, and people like Dhanidhar Koirala, and several of his works, several of his poems, where he's referring to the greatness of Bhanubhakta and how it hasn't been properly appreciated in a place like Darjeeling, or amongst what he calls the Gorkha Jati, uh, you know, uh, and the need to appreciate him further. These it, that process actually began from there, and it was taken forward by somebody like Surya Gewali, who created an entire story around Bhanubhakta that allowed him to figure as the perfect, heroic figure for the rebirth of the nation, right? And which was expressed through, and the rebirth was left incomplete by Bhanubhakta, and it was sort of, contingent amongst the nationalist move, the nationalists of the early 20th century, to take forward the unfinished work of Bhanu Bhakta to its logical conclusion. Now, in creating the concept of the rebirth, there was also a need to create a concept of the birth, right? And for which Patsurya Bikram Gewali, and I'm not getting into the details of how we came to Darjeeling and how we found work in the Darjeeling High School, along with Dhanidhar Koira and Surya Bikram Gewali. As a matter of fact, all three of them taught my grandfather while he was a student there. The stories I've heard about them, it's just phenomenal, which is why this book is a little personal to me. Anyway, I digress. The fact of the matter is that Surya Bikram Gewali now started creating a pantheon of other heroes, right? A pantheon of heroes that included people like Dravya Shah, Ram Shah, and most importantly, Prithvi Narayan Shah. Until then, whether within the Gorkha Samrajya, or what was now then by the 1930s known as Nepal, Prithvi Narayan Shah is a lost figure. He's not even seen as a very important figure. The reference to him comes as Bada Maharaj, but apart from that, the figure that the Ranas were far more comfortable with portraying as sort of the national the national hero was actually Jang Bahadur Rana. It wasn't Prithvi Shah. The cult of Prithvi Shah was actually created by Surya Bikram Mewali in Darjeeling, because by the way, when I mention somebody like Prithvi Shah, I don't mean how, I don't refer to this figure as how he developed in the Nepali nation state post 1951. He was seen as the heroic figure who brought together the community and constructed the community out of the diversity of castes and ethnic groups that existed in the region, right? But it's not, but if the narrative would to just say that he was a conqueror that brought all of these people together, that wouldn't that story does not have the same ring. The idea was that all of these groups, whether it was Mughals, whether it was Gurungs, whether it was Rais, Hindus, etc., were staying separately because there was no one to bring them together. The concept of unity had always existed in all of these groups. And it was only Prithvi Narayan Shah, taking from the long lineage of the Shah dynasty, going all the way back to Dravya and Ram Shah, who sort of helped bring the community, or rather brought the community together. And now that there was the hero for the birth, there was a necessity for a hero for the tragic hero for the downfall. And the tragic hero for the downfall was somebody like Balbhadra Thapa, who in the defense of Kalapani, or Nalapani, the areas that were in controversy recently, who heroically defended the fort, but unfortunately lost. And the Treaty of Zigauli was seen as this very, this tragic treaty that caused the downfall of the Nepali Jati, which was very different from how the Gorkha narrative was structured. The Gorkha narrative would see the Treaty of Zigauli, at least the Anglo-Gorkha War, as the beginning of the Gorkha martiality. So my point being, there are two different narratives of the Nepali Jati narrative that is emerging at this point in Darjeeling, and the Gorkha martiality narrative, which is perhaps emerging more with the colonial writers. And it's interesting how in Darjeeling we have imbibed both. Anyhow, the other thing that we need to remember here, I realize that I'm probably running short of time, I'll quickly say this and sort of end, is the fact that okay, I'm going to answer
Thank you, sir, for your very insightful and informative session. Now, I would like to invite Ms. Richa Ali to take over the session.
Good evening. I'm here to welcome our second resource person for today, Dr. Binu Sundas, Assistant Professor, Department of Sociology, Miranda House, University of Delhi. He was the founding faculty of Department of Social System and Anthropology, Sikkim University. He hails from Koshang, an alumni of Gothal's Memorial School, Koshang. He completed his PhD from JNU, New Delhi. He is the author of the book HIV and AIDS in Darjeeling, an emerging socio-political challenge and a heady mixture, culture, economics, history, and alcohol in Darjeeling. Apart from these two books, he has published numerous research articles in international and national journal, and also several books chapters. He has presented numerous papers in international and national seminar. He is also associated with Hiroshima University, Japan. So I would like to invite our sir, Dr. Binu Sundas, for the talk to proceed.
Can you hear me? Thank you very much.
Can I just complete what I was saying? If that's all right.
I was about to
Bindaji?
ask. Yes, I think Vinayak had not finished his talk. Yeah, please go ahead, Vinayak. I think, you left.
Yeah,
it
Bindaji,
incomplete.
thank you so much.
please go ahead.
I am so sorry. No, my internet just went one of, well, not the perks, but one of the difficult things of being in a place where there's a lot of power cuts. I just wanted to sort of, I think close I'm about 5 minutes from the conclusion, where the point being that more in terms of uh, of a union, and please, it may sound a bit politically incorrect in current times, but please understand that I'm talking about a whole different time. We're talking about unified nation. They were talking about, because the concept of a nation state hadn't evolved at that point of time. There was no Indian nation state then. There was no Nepali nation state then. And it's very difficult in that context to talk about two different kind of nationalities evolving. This is a time when the whole concept of Nepali Jati was still in a flux, so to speak. And if you look at all of their writings and you sort of look at what they're talking about a unified Jati that transcends all of these sort of national boundaries, which is really not surprising. I mean, if you think about Punjabi nationalism, right? There is no two different nationalisms that is either for a princely state like Patiala and a different for the British administered sort of areas, or it's the same for the Marathi nationalism, and it's the same here. So in their context, the Nepali Jati that they are speaking about, the Nepali community, the Nepali nation that they are talking about, transcended that nation state. But after 1951, things changed. Because after 1951, what happened was that that particular nation, Nepali nation, was absorbed by the Nepali nation state. And Nepali nation state, or rather the Nepal nation state, now took all of these aspects that were developed in Darjeeling, the concept of unification, the concept of Jatiya, all of these ideas that could only actually take place. And it's interesting what Surya Bikram Gewali says when he comes to Darjeeling, that the first time, what he says is that when he comes to Darjeeling, that he notices a community that is unified. He notices a nation that is unified despite all its caste and class differentiations. And as I mentioned, it was only in a place like Darjeeling that he could have seen such a thing. If he had gone to Kathmandu, which he does, by the way, to meet Babaram Acharya, but that kind of situation would not have been possible in a place like Kathmandu or any other place in Nepal, the idea of a unified nation. So when he spoke about a unified Nepali nation, he actually took the prototype that was developed in Darjeeling. And sort of, and when the Nepali nation state took over that particular Nepali nation, they took over all of these aspects and then superimposed it through, especially after Mahendra Bir Vikram Shah takes over power in the late 1960s and ushers in the Panchayati Raj, where all of these concepts of unification, all of these concepts about Nepaliness or Nepali Jati is now forced through the creation of a Nepali, of a nationalist historiography in Nepal, or nationalist historiography of Nepal, where people like D.R. Regni, Babu Acharya, and the whole organization that is known as Itihas Sanshothan Mandal sort of reiterates that idea further. After that, and the other thing is that that kind of nationalist narrative also went very well with the kind of the nation that Nepal was developing into, which is best sort of demonstrated in the dictum "Ek Desh, Ek Base, Ek Bhasa." So these were aspects that were developed in Darjeeling and then sort of superimposed there. But what they had to do, and which goes along with what Sudipta Kaviraj was talking about, was how the narrative sort of undergoes changes when it becomes a narrative of nation state. Because in Nepal, now all connections to Darjeeling had to be forgotten. All the contributions of Sudapa had to be forgotten. All the contributions of the Gorkhas had to be forgotten. As a matter of fact, one time actually narrates a very interesting story that in the primary level of education in Nepal, there was a story that was usually read. A story, I think it is by Pasmitaran Bajagale VC, which was later on removed from Nepal because nationalism to a state, or being nationalist to a nation state, did not sort of imbibe, could not reconcile itself with the idea of a soldier fighting for a different nation. So from within Nepal, the idea of the Gorkha became slowly and steadily it started becoming slowly and steadily eliminated from the national consciousness. The Gorkha soldier became eliminated. Balbhadra Kunwar, who after his defeat at Nalapani in the earlier narrative of Surya Bikram Kewari, went to the Sikh state and fought for Ranjit Singh, etc. That story had to now be modified. He could not go to another state and fight because that would not fit very well with that sort of narrative. And it's interesting what happens in Darjeeling, because this is the same point of time where the Gorkhaization of politics actually begins. The reiteration of the Indianness of Nepalis within Darjeeling also has to emerge. And then all of this leads to the culmination of this particular nation now looking for a state. I think I'll have to India. I think I've exceeded my time. So thank you all for giving me this opportunity, and I'm really sorry for all the technical snags that sort of happened in between.
Thank you, sir, for this wonderful session. Now I would like to invite Dr. Binu Sundas to begin his presentation.
Okay. Thank you very much. And before I start, I would like to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to interact with people I'm very fond of. Right, I'm very fond of my place. Yeah, and yes. So my topic for the day is people, politics, and protest, understanding through Goffman's dramaturgy. So we have politics, we have protest here, and of course we also have people. So before I start, I would just like to say that this is a purely academic endeavor, right? It's a kind of an analysis. It's an analysis of the political situation that prevails in a place, and it's purely political, right? So I what I'm talking about, you can see it from both the sides. So you can see it from the side of whichever political spectrum you belong to. So if you belong to the right, you can see from the right. If you belong to the left, you can see from the perspective of the left. So here, when I'm talking about protest and I'm talking about politics, I'm talking in general about the kind of politics we've had in Darjeeling for a long, long time. Though my reference, of course, when I'm talking here, my reference is very, very contemporary. But as I said, you can see it as the way you want to from the position you have in the political spectrum. And yeah, and and I would also like to say that please do not if you do not agree to what I'm saying, that's fine. But yeah, please take it as an academic endeavor and not a political endeavor here, right? Because when I spoke as a politician by default, many people wanted me to speak as an academician, right? And that cannot happen. So when you are speaking as a politician, you have certain things to say and you say it in a certain manner. And here I am talking as an academician, so my endeavor is purely academic. I do not want to vilify anyone, nor do I want to glorify anybody here. So this is a very, very academic endeavor. So I would, so having said this, I had to say this because Principal Sir, while opening, he did talk about, not to politicize, not to sensationalize things. So okay, so I'm trying to look at, people, politics, and protest in a reason from the dramaturgical approach. So this approach was this theoretical position is associated with Erving Goffman, and it comes from his book, The Presentation of the Self in Everyday Life. Of course, along with this, other works of Erving Goffman has also been referred, and many of the ideas of this everyday protest that I'm discussing today has come from the work of T.K. Oman, a renowned sociologist. Those who study sociology will be familiar with these names, right? So the conceptualization of everyday protest here has been drawn from the work of T.K. Oman. So, as I said, dramaturgy is a theoretical position associated with Erving Goffman, and he uses the stage and theater as its key organizing metaphor. So, dramaturgy studies the micro order of interaction, highlighting the ways in which people are engaged in impression management. Right. So, what do you understand by impression management? It highlights the ways in which people, in the company of the others, strive to present an image of themselves in a particular manner. So in this process of studying impression management, two concepts are very, very relevant. One is the backstage and the other is the front stage. So when we are talking about the when we are talking about the backstage is the space where the actor does not have to force himself, herself towards any impression management and be his or her own true self, right? She does not have to impress anybody. The individual can be his or her true self. So there is this absence of audience. On the other hand, the front stage is the space where the actor has to play his or her role to impress upon the audience. Therefore, the actor may not be showing his or her genuine self and only performing the role that suits the test of the audience. So the focus of this approach is the way in which actors manipulate gestures to create an impression in a particular social setting or in a particular social situation. So government is concerned with the process of impression management and how they manipulate not just a single but multiple situations. So situations in this dramaturgy becomes a very, very important aspect. So when individuals communicate, they take into consideration the attitude of the others and accordingly modify their behavior. So in the interactionist literature, you will, when the actors, when the individuals try to communicate and try to take into account the consideration of the attitude of the others and accordingly modify their behavior, we say this to be definition of the situation. Right? So government observed and interviewed and talked to people in public places, situations which provided anonymity to actors. The public place I am referring to here in my analysis is the social media, and especially the Facebook, which provides anonymity to the actors. Facebook provides a relatively impersonal and anonymous setting where interpersonal interaction can take place. So the aim of this paper, the aim of this lecture is to analyze primarily how politically powerless engage in everyday protest in the conditions of extreme repression to which they are subjected to, and try to assert their identity and change the rules of interaction. The analysis is based also on content analysis of a purposefully selected comment on Facebook pages and observation from a distance to understand how protest and movements is sustained at the micro level of interaction. So why did I choose Goffman? Why did I choose Goffman and his dramaturgy approach to understand the protest? Is because what has happened is that over the years, Gorkhaland movement and politics of the hills have been studied by many scholars, but from a very, very macro perspective, macro structural perspective, often ignoring the agency of the actors. So the actors who are very, very important in this dynamics of social movement, they are always, most often, they are forgotten. So this is one of the reasons why I have taken Goffman's approach to understand protest and politics. However, the actors, the self is important aspect in understanding the political processes as they participate in it, and the self is a consequence of a dialectical relation or a dialectical interaction between I and me. So this self I'm talking about I, I'm talking about me, and I'm talking about the self. So this I, me and self comes from the work of George Herbert Mead, who is very, very important theorist, philosopher in terms of interactionism. So when he's talking about I is your subjective inner creative self, right? I is your subjective you, right? When we are talking about me is the organized attitudes others connect to you, and as well as to the wider self, wider society, right? On the other hand, when we talk about self, this self is in a very, very simple terms, you can say the self is the juxtaposition of both I and me, right? So action is an it's a part of the interaction process. Actors do not simply act, but act on the basis of how he or she defines the situation, how he or she thinks others will view their action, right? So the actors are reflexive. They are reflective in terms of their action and in terms of their acting, right? And also the fact that the traditional historiography and also the post-factum analysis on movement studies have, as well as on the studies of Gorkhaland, has had a macro top-down approach, right? And as I said before, we've always tried to forget the actors, and I'm trying to bring the actors into limelight here. So what I, as a self, you as a self, do in terms of this movement, whether you protest, you do not protest, whether you support, you don't support, what has been your action, right? So I am just trying to understand people here, what has been their position, right? So I wanted to discuss the situation, the political situation of Darjeeling. I'm so sorry. My dogs are just they are barking now. I'm really sorry. So yeah, I was saying that but all of us are aware of what happened, so I will not get into the details of it. But however, those people who are not aware of what has happened during the agitation of Gorkhaland in 2017, I just want to say that the agitation, the movement abruptly ended because of some action by some leaders, right? So that is how the movement basically ended in 2017. So this the abrupt end of to the movement brought many changes and upheaval in the society, and we are all aware of it, what kind of changes and upheaval that came across. But but the most important, the social structure and particularly the political structure changed. It underwent, to me, it underwent a drastic change, and what has happened in this process is there is a very, very strong current of exclusion and inclusion taking place. So this exclusion and inclusion is taking place on the basis of your position vis-a-vis the dominant political discourse. So where do you position yourself vis-a-vis the dominant political discourse? That determines whether you are excluded or you are included in the political process, right? So this selective exclusion and inclusion in various kinds of social and communication networks are also based on power relations. So power relation, understanding of power relation again becomes very, very important, and power can be defined as the capacity to impose one's vision over the other, right? And constantly this is reinforced in the society with with constant increase in the rate of networks through media. We are losing the face-to-face interaction, and the use of internet has restructured the political, economic, social, cultural aspects of the society. However, what needs to be understood is that communication with the help of technology cannot be isolated from the communities of which we are part of, right? So this communicative action we are having today, it is part of the society. So one very important, along with all these things happening, one very important aspect of development that occurred in the political process and structure was the fact that the means of authority and violence became total in scope and very bureaucratic in form. So organized collective actions that posed a direct or immediate threat to the power holders was registered and is also being registered with the help of state apparatus. This result, so when you are registered with the help of state apparatus, this results in fear And the self that was perceived to be, a total entity is fractured. And when it is fractured, the presentation in everyday life invariably is in a fragmented form and it's in a fragmented form and takes place in an anonymous and impersonal context. Right? In such a situation of total dominance, there is absence of space for dissent and protest. So, in such a situation, protest takes a different form than the traditional ways of protesting. And what do we engage in? The forms of everyday protest. So, in the case of politics in Darjeeling, in any form of protest if any forms of protest is detected, it immediately, we all know the situation there, right? So, though physically people are absent, but the individual or group against whom the protest is, so, people are protesting through the use of social media, and even if against whom these protests are directed, and if that person or the individual or the group is present or not present, we can say that even if they are physically even if they are physically absent, but the individual or the group against whom the protest is taking place is directed in a political context, and also the anonymous protester is somehow known to the community, right? We can therefore say face-to-face interaction is taking place, as Goffman says, and I'm quoting Goffman here. Goffman says, "My perspective is situational," meaning here a concern for what one individual can be, alive to at a particular moment. This often involving a few other particular individuals and not necessarily restricted to the mutually monitored arena of face-to-face gatherings. So this kind of protest can take place in different forms and arenas, right? So another important aspect of everyday protest is the fact that in an oppressive situation, people have to register the protest in a very secretive manner and cannot do it openly. So one of the ways of doing this is to show false respect and esteem. So respect is shown in front stage and it is negated in the back stage. So what is happening today? So you are showing respect, but once you reach home, you just start gossiping around that about that person, and also you start ridiculing the same person. So the respect and esteem shown in a very instrumental. It is shown in a very instrumental and utilitarian manner. People show this respect and esteem in order not to be harassed, and also for the sake of material benefits. As it is known, fact that people are engaged in impression management and are playing a role, not much is attached to such behaviors from the others in the community as well, as all are aware of the prevailing political conditions. Therefore, the false respect and esteem shown to those who enjoy political capital today is accepted by all as an act of survival without harassment and further actions. This action of the people is not an act of dishonesty, but rather an endeavor to perform on the basis of their experience of the political victimization. So people experience political victimization because of the control of political and economic capital by those who ended the movement in 2017. Because of their political and economic status, they do not have to act in a manner the common people have to. So there is not much of difference in the manner in which they act in the front and the backstage. So the people with power, they do not act in a different manner in the front as well as the backstage. uh, there is there is not much of a difference in the manner in which they act. This more or less homogeneous behavior is not a reflection of their honesty, but because they are in a position to do so. The incumbent politicians are dependent, of course, they are dependent on public support, but since these whosoever it was, people had defied them time and again, as was evident in the 2000 Lok Sabha election, as well as the by-election to the Legislative Assembly Darjeeling seat. They engaged in acts of channeling state resources to certain clients to establish their support base. They have privileged those they thought are supporting them and withdrawn from the defectors, right? This has also resulted in a kind of a punishment regime, trapping the people into supporting the politics, their politics and their system. So they are constantly trying to monopolize politics by enforcing punishment regime in both the front and the backstage by the surveillance, by virtue of surveillance of the surveillance of the public loyalty. They're distributing resources to those who they perceive to be loyal to them, which is an action directed towards legitimization of their authority. They are also blocking distribution of resources as a form of soft repression to discourage people from joining oppositions and being vocal critic of them and their politics. So presently, in a place, they are engaged in deriving their legitimacy with the promise of development and promise of employment in both the front and the backstage. Instead of development and employment, what people have received is threat and the inability of these people to solve the problems experienced by people in their everyday lives, which have further strengthened people's resolve and belief that the present situation or the present leadership are there only to fulfill their political motives. This has a consequence, make them utilize their office and position and relation with the others as a means of soft repression and institutionalization of money, power, and political patronage. Using their office, they have selected party cadres and contractors contracts for developmental projects, thereby giving rise to a new elite. Such top-down approach to development does not benefit in any tangible manner the commoners. However, for many, extending the support, whether true or false, is a reflection of instrumental action evolving from the fear of victimization and atrocities, or the fear of losing personal benefits. Such actions on the part of the present incumbents and the use of state repressive apparatus has resulted in a culture as well as politics of silence in the ground situation, which has subsequently encourage people to act differently in the front stage and the back stage. So apart from these things, there is also what T. Kyoman says as aggressive forms of everyday protest. So the aggressive forms of everyday protest are of two types, the verbal and behavioral. So verbal protest is symbolic. It's symbolic, and it does not result in any gain for the ones who indulge in this verbal protest, or the protest against whom it is directed. Those people also do not lose anything, or do not lose anything material. But however, symbolic protest has the power to tremendously impact the social and moral position of those people against whom these protests are directed. So symbolic protest has in a situation where people cannot act freely and with freedom, and where there is restriction, symbolic protest can have enormous efficacy. So, so I've done a content analysis of around 7,050 comments in Facebook from the 1st of January to the 15th of August this year. But I will not talk about talk about what is happening, but yes, the kind of phrases, the kind of words that has been used in this in these comments, you can make out how people are protesting against certain people in the hills. So one of the many jargons, of the many phrases that people use to describe and people use to show their dissent and protest, I think the use of Jai Gorkha, Jai Gorkhaland is also a very, very important representation of protest in the social situation. So, yes, the use of many phrases, it's compounded. So a person is using, 2-3 phrases in his one comment. So those things are there, right? So, so out of the 7,050 comments that I analyzed, did the content analysis about, right? So this aspect of Jai Gorkha, Jai Gorkhaland as a representation of protest is very, very eminent there. So people there in the Facebook, they are able to voice their, articulate their protest is because they are in the backstage. That is where it is the space where they can act according to their self. It is the space where they can be their self, the genuine self. They do not have to present any kind of impression management there. So that is how they are acting. Now, apart from that, the content analysis of 7,050 comments. Apart from that, I just zeroed down on another 150 people and looked after their thinking. Like these 150 people, I thought, whose comment again I returned to, and I thought these 150 people were not politically inclined towards anybody. I saw them as politically neutral. So I went there, and again I could see that, again from these 150 people also, that there were a lot of verbal protest in Facebook. So outside of this, outside of this content analysis, I have till now interviewed 65 people, and I'm not going to go into the details of this people, but yeah, I would just like to read some of the comments that these people gave, right? So I would just like to quote, like a student said, "I want to write what is happening, but I'm reluctant to do so as I'm apprehensive about the consequences," right? We can only vent our anger among the near and dear ones, right? So similarly, another respondent said, "We can only talk among ourselves. There is so much of anger and frustration among the people for what has happened and happening, and I hope people press the right button in 2021. So, these are the kind of comments which shows how people are protesting with regards to the political situation back home at the moment. So another person said that Facebook has at least given some space to vent anger. Otherwise, in this situation, it is very difficult. So these are the kind of protest and verbal attack the people are engaged in. And the other form of protest that is very, very visible today is the use of memes. So people are using memes, and they are just circulating it, and they are protesting with the help of these memes. So So all this kind of protest is going on, right? So, but on the other hand, the other party, the those group of people against whom the protests are going on, they are also in a similar fashion engaged in redeeming their status and self-esteem. So they are also engaging themselves in other forms of interaction in this world of social media. So what they are doing is how they are trying to impress, how they are trying to manage the impression is by different ways of doing things. So how they are doing is they are coming up with photos and pictures of people, photos and pictures showing how different people have pledged to support them. So they post a photograph saying that, okay, these many families along with these many people have today pledged to support us. So it's a both way process going on. Both the parties, or whosoever the actors are there in this political playground that we have in Darjeeling today, all of them are in their own manner involved and engaged in managing their impression as well as seeking support from the people. But people have their own position, their own understanding of the situation, and people are taking their own ways of showing their grievances or their support. So both sides are going on, and they are engaged in this political dialogue, and people there are using their agency to talk about, to vent their anger. So why this use of social media here as an act of face-to-face, as an act of impersonal interaction is these forms of protest that is going on in the social media are not traditional forms of protest, and therefore they are not organized. So, and because by virtue they are not organized, they do not disturb law and order. So since law and order is not disturbed, in this situation, what is happening is the people who are protesting are at least perceiving a false sense of guarantee that the protest that they are engaged in and this arena of from where they are protesting gives them an immunity from any kind of confrontation with the law enforcing agencies. So this is how protest today is going on in our hills, and this is a part of a larger work. So I have just skipped many aspects of the work, keeping in view the time, and also because because I just wanted to add here to what the principal sir said in the very beginning. So thank you very much. I would like to stop here. Thank you very much, and would be glad to take up any questions you all have. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. Now, I would like to request Ms. Sika Chaudhary to introduce our third speaker for the day.
I'm sorry, are we not taking questions or?
Sir, we'll have an introduction session afterwards.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Richa. A very good evening to all of you. Okay, let me first introduce myself. I am Shikha Chatri from the Department of Political Science, Kalimpong College. Okay, now without wasting our time, next move on to the next session, that is the valedictory session. The valedictorian for today is Dr. Tikendra K. Chatri. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Chatri to you all. Dr. Chetri hails from Assam. He has done his schooling from Garubasa Hindi Vidyalaya and Siddhi Kotra Higher Secondary School, Chirang, Assam. He has completed his graduation in political science from Bogegaon College under Guwahati University. He has pursued his B.Ed from the College of Teachers Education, Kokrajhar. He has completed Masters in Political Science and History from Guwahati University and has done Diploma in Human Rights from Indian Institute of Human Rights, Delhi. He has completed his MPhil on Buffer Ethnic Identity, a case of Gorkhas in multi-ethnic contestation, based in Chirang, Assam, and PhD on impacts of ethno-political mobilization on minorities, a case of Gorkhas of Assam, both from the Department of Peace and Conflict, Sikkim University. He is also a postdoctoral fellow of ICSSR New Delhi, working on scheduled tribe status and seats reservation among different communities in Sikkim, an inclusive approach. He has published numerous articles in international and national journals. Besides, he has also been presented Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam National Youth Award 2020 by International Institute for Social and Economic Reforms, Bengaluru. Presently, he is a teaching faculty in Department of Peace and Conflict Studies, Sikkim University. So we would like to welcome you once again, sir.
Good evening, all. And it's a great pleasure on my part to have this, participation in the beautiful national seminar organized by Kalimpong College. So my heartiest thanks goes to the organizing committee of this national webinar of Kalimpong College, and I'm very, it is great opportunity for me to hear from my own teacher, Dr. Bin Sunda sir, and Dr. Binaya Sundas from Center for Himalayan Studies, North Bengal University. So without wasting much time, I want to, am I audible to everyone? Hello?
Yes,
Hello?
Tikendra, you are very much audible. Tikendra, you are audible.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank
Yes, sir, you're audible.
And
You're audible, sir.
thank you. Thank you so much. So, without wasting much time, I would really want to enter into the today's topic, that is nationalism, people protest, a perspective from Himalayan region. So first of all, this is a very big and very vast topic, and after hearing from so eminent, so established authorities of the region, Dr. Binu Sundas sir and Binayak Sundas, so it's a kind of battling with sun, showing a candle in my hand. So I, as if the speaker of valedictory session, is my duty to interpret the speech have been given by former speakers, but I don't think I'm kind of knowledge and learned enough to interpret the speech have been so far delivered by our former speakers, my own teacher Binu Sundas sir and Binayak Sundas, Dr. Binayak Sundas. So if I go to interpret the speeches have been delivered so far by our former speakers, that will be just repetition and kind of back kind of presentation. So I don't want to waste time. So I really want to enter into the broad the concept put forwarded through this the today's webinar. First of all, the nationalism. We have so many kind of phenomena in this topic. Similarly, we have so many variables. Nationalism, people, protest, and then the larger issue is Himalayan region, because Himalayan region encompasses through undivided India. I mean India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and then even Hindu Kush, that is, Afghanistan, and then the small tiny, of course, sorry, I should not say this tiny Himalayan kingdom, but Himalayan kingdom, Nepal, Bhutan, and then the former Sikkimese kingdom. So it even exists up to, Myanmar. So, talking about the Himalayan region is a very big region, vast topic, and talking about nationalism is very risky kind of, so subjective as our the principal, sir, Dr. Rajendra sir said. So, first of all, nationalism. Nationalism is, it's a very beautiful topic. Of course, it's a very vast and it's very difficult to, talk within 2 hours. So for me, I think I will given only 10 minutes. As the brochure has been given to me. I'm given 10 minutes. It's too less to talk in 2 hours. Even in too less to talk in 2 days. It's too less to talk about even in 20 books. But still, we have to summarize somewhere. So, nationalism is always, it's beautifully connected in this topic, like nationalism, people, and protest. Everywhere, if we see the genealogy, if we see the origin of nationalism, it's always through the protest. Either nationalism has created protest or nationalism comes through the protest. If we go to our very established historian Binaya is there, he knows about the Westphalian Treaty of 1648. So because whenever we trace the history of nation state, we always go to the Westphalian Treaty. So it was very big, devastating history. Every one of the 3 persons were killed during that, how anti-Habsburg, massacre. After that, when we come to Bourbon, anti-Bourbon dynasty movement in France, because when we talk about the modern nationalist movement, then we always trace French Revolution. So French Revolution also, it was very destructive, because and then the very definition of nationalism is destructive. Before going to understanding the nation, we need to nationalism. We need to know the definition of nation. There are 1,000 definitions of nation. There is 1,000 definitions of nationalism. But before that, when you go to understand the nation means a sense of oneness through the sense of belongingness with common culture, common land, common history, common language, common food habit. Okay, and here the question lies: whose common language? Because modern states are, especially in the era of globalization, states are not of one linguistic group. States are not of one ethnic group. States are not of one cultural group. States are not of one food habit group. So whose cultural belongingness should be considered? Whose linguistic oneness should be, linguistic group should be considered? So is destructive, is self-divisive, because there is very beautiful definition of nationalism. Now the nationalism, that is the definition of nationalism, nation. Now when we go to understand the nationalism, the establishment, territorialization of and the emotional integration of a particular nation which has sense of oneness through the sense of belongingness, having common culture, language, food habit, history, and the legendary and the territory is nationalism. So nationalism is always subjective, as our principals have said, is always destructive. There is already a beautiful definition of nationalism. Nationalism is the identification of one's own nation and support for interest, especially to the exclusion or the detriment of interest of other. That means nationalism is always subject to otherize. It's more otherization than the integration. So it's not a kind of apprehension, but I can put today's example. Principal sir, Dr. Rajendra sir, he was introducing the today's speaker. He was talking about Dr. Binaya Sunda sir. He was talking about Binaya Sunda sir, but he never mentioned Tikendra Chetri is there, because I think intentionally or unintentionally he did not think that I was in the panel. That means nationalism is kind of otherization, consciously or unconsciously, that our principal sir has maybe unintentionally done it, because I'm not from Darjeeling Hills. He might be felt that way unintentionally. sorry, it's not to apprehend anyone. So nationalism has, let's come me back to the today's topic, nationalism, people and protest. Which nationalism should we talk today? Ethnic nationalism, civic nationalism, expansionist nationalism, romantic nationalism, cultural nationalism, revolutionary nationalism, post-cultural nationalism, linguistic nationalism, liberation nationalism, left-wing nationalism, right-wing nationalism, liberal nationalism. Which nationalism to talk? Because nationalism itself is a very vast topic, but it's a back topic. Now let us come to this. The Himalayan region has been already, the part of today's, the next, variable is Himalayan region. Let me go to the Himalayan region. So when we talk about nationalism in Himalayan region, then we cannot forget it's because a very big nationalistic movement that Himalayan region has witnessed is the Indian nationalist movement. Because as the topic is based to the nationalism and people and their protest, so I must mention that the Indian national movement. So when we were colonized, it's a very known fact. So colonizers, especially the British colonizers, they brought the Western idea of nation, Western idea of nationalism, and they tried to suppress us through their Western lens of nation, and they tried to homogenize entire nation through colonial perspective. Of course, and then against that, of course, in 1757, the anti-colonial movement was already started by Siraj-ud-Dowlah, but it was kind of the, a small kind of Mughal nationalism, but it was defeated. After that, the colonizers, after 100 years of British colonization, I mean, full-fledged colonization in 1757, then coming to 1857, we Indians started to fight against the British colonization. So, and from 1857 to 1947, we fought for 90 years. So it was 90 years long nationalist movement that the Himalayan region has witnessed. It was apart. Similarly, when we talked about Himalayan region, then I must not forget especially to mention Bhutan, mention the Nepal. So Nepal also started this national movement. Of course, it was the consolidation movement by Prithviraj Shah in 1742, and he conquered three Malla kingdoms like Kathmandu, Pathan, and then Bhadgaon. Then he created the Gorkha Empire, as our Binaya sir said. So it was a Gorkha kind of Samrajyam. Similarly, in Bhutan, the Bhutan started to consolidate in 1624 by Samdrup Nawang Namgyel. But coming to 1907, the Dev Raja was killed, and the Wangchuk dynasty was created to consolidate the modern Bhutan by Jigme Ugyen Wangchuk. Then there were kind of the lastly we have the Jigme Khesar Namgyel Wangchuk. So this way the whole nationalism was started. We can consider anyway kind of a democratic nationalism or the monarchical nationalism. Similarly, when we talk about Himalayan region, we have to mention the former Sikkimese kingdom also that was started by Phuntsuk Namgyel, and there are 12 kings, and the Chogyals in former Sikkimese kingdom, and coming to Palden, and it was ended. So after that, the democratization was started. Now let us come to democratic nationalism. Modern states are, we were one or other way. Entire the Indian subcontinent, some small state, some small states should not be mentioned, that Bhutan or Nepal were not directly colonized by British Empire, but there is huge influence. And undivided India was fully colonized. When we were colonized, the Western idea of nationalism was brought and imposed upon us, and that was mono-ethnic nationalism. When we see the Spain, when we see the France, when we see the Germany, so those days they started nation and they consolidated their nation state having single linguistic group, single single constitution, and single common history. But when that idea was brought to and imposed upon us in Eastern world, that is Oriental, world, as Edward said, it was fully kind of contradictory. It was kind of detrimental, and then we we have very huge, if we count an entire Himalayan region, we have more than 7,000 linguistic groups, 5,000 different ethnic, tribal groups, and we have more than 11 different regions, 11 different climatic regions. So in the Himalayan region, the British colonizers, they imposed their Western type of nationalism upon us, and it has created huge protests. Of course, till 1947, the Indian subcontinent, particularly the undivided India, fought against colonization. That was called, this is called always anti-colonial nationalism. But after that, we have seen so many proto-nationalism, and this nationalism has created huge problem because the colonizers left us. After that, we were to consolidate our nation. But what we have done, the great mistake was we tried to establish the Western way of nation state, which was fully against our social composition, our historical composition. Because as I have mentioned, there are so many large number of ethnic, cultural, historical groups in the region. Then one particular, the dominant and then the hegemonic group started to colonize, kind of impose their way of nationalism upon us, like one single flag. Whose flag is that? One single national language. Whose language is that? Because we have 1752 language and dialectic groups. We brought one history. Whose history is that? There is so many histories from Northeast. There is so many histories from, even if you count Sikkim, Sikkim has more than, kind of 500 shared histories. Darjeeling has more than 300 shared histories. Whose history is that? Of course, if it go deep, then of course this somebody may take it negatively, but that is the bitter truth, and it has created a huge problem. Now, where should I narrow down the today's topic? Because if I go this way, so it will be very difficult to conclude. So somewhere I should come down. Although it is the Himalayan region, I should not forget to mention these areas, but I should conclude my topic, so I should narrow down it. So let it be narrowed down to the, as already two former speakers, my teachers have already mentioned the Darjeeling Hills area. But there are see, it's not to offend you, both the speakers and then the organizers. When we say Darjeeling should not be just considered a geographical piece. Please just think it in a broader sense. Darjeeling is a civilization. It's bigger than the geographical limitation. And whenever we talk about Darjeeling, so sometimes we feel that it's really kind of, we're narrowing down somewhere, and so we really, kind of putting very small space which have very larger, meaning. Now, let me go to first speaker, Binaya sir. Sir, if I'm not going to offend you, and it's a kind of as an academician, and you are much senior to me, so I think I should put certain points which really, stood as contradictory to my understanding. You just sir told that Nepal, the word started to be established in 1920. Similarly, you told that Nepali is the origin in 1930s. So I cannot understand, where you trace, when we talk about Darjeeling, your topic was a story for the nation, creation of Nepali national narratives in Darjeeling. It really, create confusion in my understanding that if Nepal word is origin of 1920, if Nepali word is origin of 1930, so where you trace the Nepali nation history in Darjeeling? I think Darjeeling has a very big history, because when we see the Regulating Act of 1773, then Governor General of Bengal, because the Governor General of India was declared later, British East India Company had Governor General of Bengal after they got Diwani in 1765. So they declared Governor General of Bengal and the Regulating Act in 1773, then that Governor General sent and officials to understand the the whole social structure and then prospect in the Himalayan region. Then one officer came in this region and he wrote to the Governor General that Gorkha population is fast growing population, is very powerful population, and that should be contained very soon. Otherwise, it will be very big challenge to British East India Company to expand its interest toward the east. It was said in 1774. So it was deliberately the Gorkha word was used. That where Nepali word creates sense in Darjeeling, I really don't understand it, because Darjeeling is the part of Sikkim. It was the very contestation space of Tibet, Bhutan, the then Gorkha kingdom. Still, I don't consider Nepal. I just say the former Gorkha kingdom, and then the Sikkim. So it was very big, the multi kingdom contestation space. So it created that kind of society. So I don't think that Darjeeling is kind of late 1930 Nepali origin territory. And now when we talk Nepali nationalism, there is no Nepali nationalism in India, what I know, because when we talk about nationalism, then in Nepali language there is two terms. One is Rashtravad and what is Jatibad. But when we talk about Rashtravad, that is very much state centrism. But when we say nationalism and when we go to its meaning in Nepali, it is Jatibad. That means nation centrism, ethnic centrism. But when you come to Darjeeling, it's common misery. Lepchas have common misery, Limbu, kind of Tibetans have common misery, Gorkhas have common misery, Bhutias have common misery. So the very idea of Gorkha land is to fight against the common misery. Of course, now we have to understand what kind of nationalism that Gorkha land is evolved with. When we see nationalism's meaning is very destructive, and in post-colonial space in India, when the centrist nationalism was tried to be imposed, then we could see very many sub-regional contestation in the south, like Dravidian, Punjab. Similarly, in northeast, with the Mizo movement, we got Naga movement, we got a kind of Assam movement. Later, we got Bolan movement. Now, these movements were they're the counterproductive of the centrist Indian centrist nationalism. But when you come back to the Gorkhaland movement, it is always a movement to be considered as the Indianness. We must not forget it that there are so many regional movements, they were countering very much impossible Indianness. But when you come to Darjeeling, it is to be counted as Indian. It is always the movement for Indianness, but it never been considered. Always it is counted as secessionist movement. It is the foundation of Gorkha movement, never been addressed, never been, it's always tried to be counted as its mess. But when we see, and when a good academician see, the Gorkha movement that, rise in Darjeeling Hill area, Tarai and Duars, it is always to be counted as Indian. It's not against the centrist nationalism, but it is always to be the part of Indian nationalist centrist nationalism. But whatever we could say, this movement has been always crushed by. I don't want to offend any my own Bengali brethren, those who are the part of this discussion. I'm not talking about the Bengalis. It's always Kolkata tried to crush it. Kolkata always tried to portray that the Gorkha movement is anti-national movement, and center didn't give any hit to understand it. But the truth is that Gorkha movement is never the Nepali national movement. When you talk about Nepali nationals, then it goes to beyond the Mechi, because they are Nepali speaker of Nepal are Nepali nationals. We are not Nepali nationals. We are Indian Gorkha nationals. So Indian Gorkha nationals, especially Darjeeling, Tarai, and those that people are protesting is for, but in for their Indianness. They are, want to the part of this Indian nationalism. Unlike the Kashmir, Nagaland, Mizoram, because of course I'm not talking, these movements are wrong. They also have, because when the hegemonic movements, the kind of the homogenization comes, there is always a protest. But Gorkha's protest is against Kolkata hegemony, but for the Indian, kind of about, we have to be very sensitive. It is which movement is it? Kind of maybe Nepali Rashtravad or Nepali national movement or Indian movement for Indianness. We can go to the history of Darjeeling based, Darjeeling towards and Tarai based Gorkhaland movement. Then we have to trace this history. We should not go always to Sudapa. These people has already turned the Nepali terminology to and Gorkha terminology to Nepali, cover. They have given this cover, and we cannot go with only Bhanu Bhakta, because we have very big and eminent Gorkha writers. In 1893, we got beautiful write-up by Tulachan Ale, and that was Gorkha poem. It was not Nepali poem. That Manipur ko Savai, and similarly Naga Pahad ko Savai. So it was Gorkha write-up. And similarly, and this gave one kind of integration in the part. And especially when we see the participation of Dal Bahadur Giri, Hari Bahadur Gurum, Damar Singh Gurum, Kharga Bahadur Vista, Savitri Devi, and this all movement people were, our forefathers, our martyrs, they laid their life for Indian nation. It's not for Darjeeling. They didn't fight only for Darjeeling. They fought for India. And then the proper payback, proper respect is not given to the sacrifice have been given by our forefathers. So because of this kind of bitterness, the whole idea of Gorkhaland movement, especially the consolidation and then integration in the region, evolved. Similarly, when we see
It seems that there has been some technical problem. So I would like to thank Tikendra sir. Thank you, sir, for your precious time and a very informative speech. So now I would like to hand you over to Ms. Reshma Pradhan. Over to you, Reshma Di.
Okay, thank you, Sika. Now we are moving towards interactive session. So here there are some questions raised by our participant. So first questions is directed to Binayak sir. So it is from Privat Giri. We often talk about standardization of Nepali language. He really wanted to know how the process of standardization actually took place. Any detailed work on this?
Oh, sure. Can you hear me, Rishma?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Um, you know, getting a lot of anyway. Before sort of talking about Privat, and Privat is a good friend of mine. I hope Privat will forgive me. Do you, Privat, Privat, I hope you don't mind if I respond to Tikendraji's uh, questions. And they were very, and the thing is, I often tell Tikendraji that we've had about 3 or 4 rounds, because every time we meet in conferences and in seminars, we have this, and I have the utmost respect for Tikendraji's position, and as I'm sure he does for mine. But we are from two different ends of the stick, so it often leads to this kind of well, let's not call it disagreements, but debates, and that is very important in our society today. So, Privaji, I'll just respond to Tikendraji's question before getting to yours, if that's all right. Okay. Um, uh, there was a question a while ago I think it was by Raina Isha Guru, who said that I hadn't spoken about, how the narrative changes when various socio-political formations or very socio-political forces come into play. Uh, 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 well, an answer to your question is exactly what my dear old friend Tikendra just spoke about. Not so much as in what the exact words what he said, but with the spirit with what he said it in. Uh, you see, at one point of time, Bhanu Bhakta was the Jatiya icon, and he went on to be the Jatiya icon for a very long time. But unfortunately, once the nation finds a state, in this case, the Nepali nation needed to assert its Indianness, the Indian Nepali nation needed to assert its Indianness. It needed to get away from a lot of these icons who had a problematic past, people like Bhanu Bhakta, because he was associated with Nepal, and because Nepal now now claimed a stake over him. So now we needed to look for new literary icons, and the names that he mentioned are just one of them. The most prominent being Agam Singh Giri. There is, because now it's the same process with which Nepal, as I mentioned before, the Panchayati era textbooks in Nepal quietly deleted the story of Gajagale VC, Parasmani Pradhan's Gajagale VC, because that story linked them to India. You see, in the creation of national narratives, these kind of sort of situations keep on sort of coming up, where you need to change and in many ways sanitize the narrative according to political correctness and political dilemmas. Unfortunately, you see, I'm not talking from that political correctness, or rather political vantage point. I'm talking only as a mere researcher, guided by my sources, guided by theoretical aspects, and guided by a general need to be objective. Hence, why I see things in this manner. The next thing that he said was how I said Nepal came up in 1930s. Might I just uh, clarify myself? I said the term Nepal was accepted by the Kathmandu Darbar in 1930. Nepal as a term in its etymology goes back all the way to Samudragupta's time. But for a very long time, the term Nepal was only used as a reference to the valley of Kathmandu. When the British first start referring to the kings of Gorkha as kings of Nepal post the conquest of the valley by the Gorkha state, the Gorkha rulers express their displeasure over this new nomenclature. They keep, mentioning that, why are you calling us the kings of Nepal? We are not the kings of Nepal. The kings of Nepal are the Mallas. We are the kings of Gorkha. And this goes on till about 1930s. It's a very funny thing about bureaucracy today and its ancestry, the British bureaucracy. एक पल्टा data entry जब हो जाए ना, उसके बाद you can't change the name, So the British are very, 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 um, you know, how shall I put this? They're very, very adamant on using the term Nepal and the term Nepali for the language, or intimately as Kaskura, or for that matter, uh, you know, Pahadia. It in 1850, as I mentioned, Jang Bahadur Rana changes the term from the name of the language from Kaskura to Gorkhali, and it's in 1880s that Reverend Turnbull writes the lexicon for the Nepali language, and that's how the Nepali linguistic movement, again to answer Madam Ishaguru's question, how the narrative begins. You see, when the linguistic nationalism begins, and if you read Dhanidhar Koirala and all of them, they are all referring to the fact that uh, the need of a nation begins with restructuring, or rather claiming uh, the primacy of their own languages, and Dharanidhar as well as Surya Bikram Gewali goes on to talk about um, the examples of various communities like Bengalis, like Punjabis, etc., and etc., and including Germans and French, just to to let you know how Eurocentric the concept of nations are. But when they begin this process, it's actually a whole process where the language gets termed as Nepali. In Parasmani's first sort of attempt to get the language recognized by the university. The language recognized by Calcutta University is known as Nepali Pahariya Khaskura. It's later on, after the formation of the Nepali Sahitya Sammelan by Dharinder Koirala, Surya Bikram Kewali, and Parasmani Pradhan, that they make another petition to only call the language as Nepali. That's why I use the term Nepali linguistic nationalism. It has nothing to do with the fact that in about the late 1920s, early 1930s, the Kathmandu Darbar accepts the term Nepal as a term for the entire territory, which the British were always calling Nepal. Officially, in Kathmandu Darbar records, they prefer to call themselves the Gorkha Samrajya. Now, why is there Bhanubhakta? Why are we still talking about Surya Bikram Gewali, Dharinder Koirala, all of that? You see, history can't change just because these figures now have become politically inconvenient. That is doing history from a political vantage point. That is changing historical narrative as and when it suits you. Unfortunately, I'm not in the business of doing that. I am more in the business of trying to understand the complications, as Madam Ishaguru was asking, of the myriad forms of political. I'm going to answer that as well. Of all, bringing out contesting narratives, and why. And again, Tikendra ji also mentioned that the nation is about one kind of language, one kind of identity, one kind of food habits. Let me also add one more thing to that. It is one kind of language, one kind of identity, one kind of food habits imposed by the dominant group on every other group. Why it's not a consensus as such, it is which group is in dominant power, and that happens everywhere. It's the very nature of nationalism. Now, to answer Madam Mishaguru's question, you mentioned whether or not the fact that I'm not talking about power relations and I'm only talking about a narrative kind of history. I apologize for that. You see, there's only so much you can say in an hour, and my connection kept getting interrupted as well as what I was saying. Well, let me just put it this way. In a very popular story, not a popular story, but a story by Parasmani Pradhan, he mentions about how Dharanidhar Koirala, when he comes to Kurseong, he gives this very powerful speech. What was the name of the poem? It keeps falling. Whether it was Lahai or whether it was Natra Bhai Barbad, something like that. He narrates these two poems and talks about the need for a language movement, talks for the need for the reformation of Nepali language, and so on and so forth. And Parasmani mentions about how everybody was enthralled. Now, my question was, when you say everybody, do you mean everybody in Kurseong, or those very select few people who had come to hear that particular speech from Dharanidhar Koirala? Right. My point being, when Parasmani Pradhan, Surya Bikram Gewali, and they were at the epicenter of establishing Nepali as an educational medium, let's also remember the fact that they began to control knowledge production from there on. Let's not think that, and I perhaps I am a bit guilty of doing that when I referred to why Surya Bikram Gewali was able to see the Nepali nation in Darjeeling, because of the fact that here there was no dominant Gorkha state that was imposing cultures and languages on the people. Here it was more lingua franca. Those of you all who are students of languages will know that that's not how languages actually come about. It's never a consensual come together. It's always an expression of some kind of political dominance, some kind of power play and some kind of hegemonic sort of structure that's being created. And the domination of Nepali or Kaskura or Padia becoming the lingua franca also has, certain kinds of, let's just put it this way, certain kinds of power play to it, which I could not refer to. It is time थियो. So yes, the Nepali national narrative that is sort of created at this point on becomes the dominant narrative because of the fact that those who created this narrative were also the people who went on to dominate knowledge production for a very long time. To Tikendraji's argument that we now need to look for a new one is possibly the same sort of understanding of how of what Sudipta Kaviraj says, that when the nation state apart from a nation is being created, now the nation state comes about. Now there's a necessity to evolve, or there is sort of a necessity to evolve the narrative. I'm sorry, Reshma, I just went on for too long. But to be fair to me, Tikendraji did ask me a very long question. Privaji, I think I will. The names, those things we can talk in later. I think I've just taken on too much of time. Sorry, Reshma.
Hello, Reshma. Can I come in? I just want 2 minutes. 2 minutes for a comment. I want to have a comment on that.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Hi, Tikendra. I agree with Tikendra when he says that the icon or the symbols of nationality or jati like Bhanubhakta and other people need to they get changed when political dispensation want it. It is in the political interest that happens. But just to add on to that, when we talk about Bhanubhakta, he was being taken as a symbol of jati till 1985. It was only after the JNLF movement that when Subhash Singh started saying, Nepal ko, there's no connection with Nepal and all that, then there was a narrative that, we don't have connection, there is a disconnect with Nepal, and Bhanubhakta is not our Jatiya Kavi, it should be Agam Singh Giri. That was, I think JNLF did that. But if you look at the, narrative of language movement, till 84, 85, what I have seen is, as and when Nepali language movement got, ahead, with the increase in the intensity of the movement, Bhanubhakta's statue and Bhanubhakta's Ramayana got politically, symbolic, and then his statue were created everywhere. And we used to go in a long procession saying, Bhanubhakta Jindabad, Nepali Bhasha Amar Raos. But after 1985-86 movement, this process of disconnect with Bhanubhakta came in. But to be fair to Tikendra, we have been giving too much, I feel that way, that we have been exaggerating the contribution and the role of Surya Bikram Gewali and Dharanidhar Koirala. They came in 1919 and 1924 as a guest for Sahitya Sammelan. And if you look at their lives, they have not really mixed well with the local Darjeeling people. They stayed as, outsider. And if you talk about Tulsan Ali, Hazirman, Dakpan Rai, they are not being created. They were already there, but their narratives were just ignored by the dominant political discourse and dominant language discourse, as Binaya says. This is why I wanted to say. So today, what I feel is, we really need to relook and revisit our history. That is the call of the day. And being objective, and as an academician, we should be very objective and try to be objective, I don't think we will really be able to really 100% objective or neutral, but we try to be like that. Thanks. Thank you. And thanks, Resma, and I'm sorry for time I've taken. Yes, Resma, you continue.
The question is directed to Binu, sir. The question is raised by Rania Isaguru. Says that I have often been confused about the difference or academically difference between notions or academically complete or construct.
Reshma, I can't hear anything what you are speaking. There is a lot of background noise. I cannot hear anything what you are saying. I think you need to just check your microphone. I could not hear anything what you were saying.
Yes, sir. So this is a question directed to you, sir. It's from Raina.
Yes.
I have often been confused about the differences between notions or academically complete or construct of protest and resistance.
So Reshma, so I got you. So the questions are coming straight from the comments, right? So I will, I've gone through the comments. So let me address them. Okay, I will address them. Okay, so Raina Isaguru has raised quite a lot of interesting questions, and so firstly, the issue of protest and resistance. I will not take much of a time to explain in greater details what protest and resistance is all about. But let me tell you, protest is something that you disagree to and you show your displeasure about it. On the other hand, resistance is also protest, but here the difference is you do not want the event with which you have differences to occur again. So resistance seeks an action to what you want, right? The other interesting thing that Raina has spoken about is hidden transcript of Scott. Scott talks about a hidden transcript in his book Domination and the Art of Resistance, right? I was not referring, I do not know whether that was a question or whether it was a suggestion. I do not know, but let me answer. Let me try to answer what she was asking. What I was saying is not exactly hidden transcripts. So when you are talking about hidden transcripts, you are talking about something, the protest which is hidden, right? Something which does not come off. Right? But here I am talking about protest which is even with the use of fake IDs, it is there in the public, right? So I do not think that I was referring to hidden transcripts here. But on the other, also the other question which was related to what Orwell and Chomsky was talking about, let me tell you that, so if the state is in control of the protest, then how are we going to, protest? Is that protest when the state is controlling your protest? I think that would be more of a drama, right? More of a drama, and that is to an extent also happening today in a place, right? People who are in hand and gloves, with the state, they are protesting. I don't know about what they are protesting, right? So, these were the few. I think these were the comments that Raina had, and one comment was there from TK. I think from Privat, who says like, would you give us the greater details of how you selected the comments? So I had in the course of my presentation, Privat, I had said that I had selected the comments purposively, right? I have used purposive sampling there, so I have used this. Yeah, I think that is it. Oh, yeah, one very interesting comment was there about Jai Gorkha and Jai Gorkhaland by uh, uh, somebody there. Yeah, and I agree to you that Jai Gorkha, Jai Gorkhaland will be used, was used much before, and will be used, even after many, many years, even things are settled, and, whatever, even after whatever happens politically, it will be used. I agree with you, but here, uh, why I use Jai Gorkha and Jai Gorkhaland as a form of protest, right? I used this as a form of protest because here we are totally with the use of Jai Gorkha and Jai Gorkhaland, with the use of this slogan. What we are doing is we are trying to differentiate between them and us. So using Jai Gorkha, Jai Gorkhaland, I think we are registering a protest. We are in a sense talking about uh, um, the achievement of a goal. Um, yeah, and yeah, I think those are the things. And I was just a bit apprehensive of talking in details about my paper. Uh, uh, because in the very beginning, uh, Dr. Dhakal just said, do not politicize, do not sensationalize. So I was a bit apprehensive, therefore I cut short on my paper. Otherwise I had a lot of things to discuss. But however, it's okay. And yeah, if there are any more questions, I can take, and you all can have put forward your questions with the organizers. Sarat can pass it on to me, and I will try to address them. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yes, sir. There is a question from Sahitya Ratnachitri. Do you think
Sorry?
there is a question from Sahitya Ratnachitri, sir.
Oh, yes. Is government still relevant? Yeah, I think so. Government is very relevant today. Government still is relevant. You know why? And why government is very relevant today is today we become too utilitarian and materialistic. Our values are changing. We've become too materialistic, too utilitarian. We are very, very instrumental. Our values are changing. Therefore, we can, we are much more acclimatized in terms of manipulating to this situation to our favor. So government is relevant here. I would say that. So how, of course, it differs in perspective and in terms of understanding. But yeah, to me personally, yes, I think he is still relevant. But yes, you have to read Goffman together, right? I think there are other works which he's done. For instance, frame analysis, total institutions. These are very, very important works that we need to read along with his presentation of self in everyday life. So yeah, thank you. Are there any more questions, Resma?
Hello, Resma. Hello. Hello, Resma. Hello.
Hello. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Resma ji.
Yes, am I audible?
Yeah, can I take few minutes?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Only, yeah, I just want to, address the, content of our Binayak sir. Please mute your speaker. Yes, Dr. Binayak sir told. Yeah, please mute your. Yeah. Just I want to, address Binayak sir's, intervention to my, sort of lecture. Sir, we cannot go against the history. Okay, that is true, but we cannot establish wrong history also. When we, see the history, if we know that that is a wrong history, so if we cannot go against that, so at the same time, we should understand that we must not establish that history. And then, principal sir, that, after, for 19, during that, the pre-86 Andolan, Bhanubhakta was symbolically established as, symbol of Nepali speakers and all. But that was politically, in both way. I don't say that post 86 and pre 86 were correct. I don't consider either the correct. But one thing that we had, so that was politically political fault. So when we are academician, I mean, for me, it's just I'm learning at the stage of learning on it. So if that is political fault, if we can understand it, so I don't think we should go with that flow. And this is my kind of address to your intervention to my lecture. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello. So, Binu sir, would you like to go for Rima Vatya question, sir?
So, but I don't think so. Rima ma'am is Rima ma'am, are you there? I thought I will discuss with this. Okay, so she's talking about Prashant Bhushan is in trouble for a tweet, not really backstage but front stage. But don't the back and the front stage connect? Isn't the form of protest and how much upfront or front stage it is dependent on not just power but authority? In this scenario today, it is authority which also determines the politics of knowledge, and particularly in the context of I can discuss this with Rima ma'am, but since it is there, you see. Of course, I have only spoken about backstage and front stage here just to, emphasize on what I was trying to discuss and deliberate. But there is also this concept of off stage when government off stage, the concept of off stage that government talks about. That there is the absence of audience, but the person among the audience with whom you can interact, only you and that person is there, right? Yeah, this Prashant Bhushan case was a very, very important case of his tweets being taken up legally, right? And as I concluded saying, people are engaged in the social media about freely engaging themselves in social media is because there is this immunity from any kind of action. So, to remember, I was talking about all these forms of protest to a large extent is in the form of are coming from people who are using fake IDs. People who are using fake IDs. So this fake IDs also provides that shield of invisibility to the person. But here Prashant Bhushan talking about the judiciary matters and the system with his true profile and I agree with Rima ma'am saying was the result of the use of authority, right? So the judges of the Supreme Court used their authority in terms of taking action against Prashant Bhushan, and yes, the entire discourse of social movement is also based on authority from the structure of this organization to the mobilization to every aspects of the social movement, right? The decision making, all these things are dependent on authority. Power these days, we have. And also, connecting it to what Raina Isaguru was in one of her questions talking about. I was talking about the contemporary aspect of the movement that is going on, right? So, in the contemporary aspect, in the contemporary society, we have moved much ahead than what we were earlier. I'm not talking in terms of the Gorkha population or the Nepali-speaking population of India. But what I'm saying is, overall, we have progressed. We have progressed in terms of decision making, in terms of thinking, in terms of our exposure. So, it becomes very, very difficult for us to use power over the other. So here, instead of power, what we use is authority, the legitimate form of power. And yes, I totally agree with Rima ma'am that authority is very, very important, and everything is based on authority. Yeah, and yeah, with Rima ma'am, I can discuss in the department also. So it's, I think I have answered to what she was talking about. Yeah, thank you very much.
Can I quickly get in to respond to Tiganerji, Reshmaji?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Again, I'll Tiganerji, the problem is who decides what is wrong history and what is correct history. Because to suggest that the narrative that we or anybody ascribes to is the only correct history is a little bit hubris, and it's a little bit majoritarian and a bit intolerant. Uh, the only way what one can consider to be wrong history if it's based on wrong facts. Unfortunately, the things that I have mentioned uh, with regard to the use of the terms Nepali nationalism, they are not based on wrong facts. They are very strong historical facts to back that up. But I understand your point. If as Hessler says, if it passes a political currency, then the manner in which it is represented must also, have an impact in the manner in which we understand our political uh, discourse today. And that's just the thing. Even the names that you mentioned, all of them, they are also historical facts. That's the point. There is not just one narrative. Here I was mentioning about a singular narrative that was created in the early parts of the 20th century. Also, what Rajendra sir was saying, sir, the thing is, after our last discussion, it's only then I started looking at the backgrounds of Surya Gewali and Dhanidhar Koirala, and I think I completely agree with you on the fact that they came from Banaras, right, sir? And that's a place which is not, sociologically speaking, that's not a place where Nepalis are in majority. Coming to a place where Nepalis are in majority, which is why Surya Gewali was able to express or be able to feel more strongly than Parasmani Pradhan that this was the Nepali nation that this was the place where the Nepali nation could the most visualize. I think I have no discussion or no disagreements with you, sir. If anything, what you told me during our last conversation has only added to my sort of understanding. And one more thing, sir, that I'd like everyone to know, and it's also something that a lot of people suggest, that to do history minus the language, or minus the language skills. So if you remember, this is what you told me the last time. It's not just dangerous, but also very, very half-hearted. So while looking at historical facts, there's a very important need for literature and history to sort of come together. Uh, and just one last point, sir. You mentioned 1985. If you remember, that's when Bhanu Bhakta's statue in Tavasta got decapitated. So there was a very, very abject need to get away from Bhanu Bhakta as quickly as possible. And this is a very important reason why 85, you has it, because then the need for that particular Indian Nepali nation to get a state became even more pronounced. Again, taking from Sudipta Kaviraj, the entire narrative, not the entire, but aspects of the narrative had to change. Reshma, there was a question by Ashish Chetri, if I can just address that. He mentioned what Irfan Habib said about, I don't know where he mentioned this. Frankly, I didn't know Irfan Habib said anything about the Gokulan movement. But if he did, in the context of subnationalism, you see, the term subnationalism is, in my opinion, is very flawed, because it's just what a dominant nationalist or dominant nationalist narrative would call any other national movement within its state to sort of protect itself from conflicting narratives. So that term subnationalism is a very convenient term. Uh, uh, it's very possible for a nation state to hold many nationalities, and in my opinion, Indian nation state post 1947, a little bit pre 2014, was able to in its own, I won't call it beautiful, but in a very successful manner, accommodate all of these nationalities, often by using the term subnationalism. That's about it, Reshma.
Hello, Reshma. Reshma ji, hello. Hello.
I knew Tikendraji wouldn't stay away.
This is.
As a chairperson, I think it's almost 9 and we have already exceeded half an hour. So we can again continue the discourse and debate. This is not only the forum. I'm sorry right now. I think I need to close the question. I need to close the question now. Otherwise, this will go on. Yeah. So second time we can meet.
Well, intervention, sir.
We can. Okay, I'm giving you 1 minute, and that's the end of it. Please finish your. Please finish your opinion by 1 minute.
No, sir, that's very small intervention.
Just 1 minute I'm giving you.
Hello?
Please.
Hello, sir.
Yes. I'm giving you 1 minute to answer to whatever you want to make. Please. Otherwise, we need to close it.
Sure. Definitely within 1 minute.
And I will.
I want to address Binakshar's, intervention.
I will not respond.
No. Yes, sir. Hello, sir.
I will let the last word.
I'll conclude within 1 minute. Definitely, sir. Yeah, I'll conclude within one. Definitely. And even I will not respond to you even. So, nobody knows whose history is. Yeah, nobody knows. As you said that nobody knows whose history is wrong. At the same time, nobody knows whose history is right. Right. Other thing, you just say that without language, history is kind of very dangerous. Right, I accept it. But did not we had history before 1933? I mean, there was something language where I think interacting among us, right? Because as you told, just I want to address your point that you delivered during your speech that Nepali term originated in 1933. Then before 1933, did not we have kind of the medium of interaction? I think we might have. And then coming to Bhanubhakta. Of course, I respect Bhanubhakta. But before Bhanubhakta also, we know Tulachanale. We know so many kind of literary figures. So I think.
Hello.
At the same time, when we respect Bhanubhakta Acharya ji, because he gave the script form of our language. He gave it. Yes, sir. Sir.
Hello, I think Tikendraji, you have made your point clear. So I think thank you very much now.
Yes.
Reshma, continue with your program.
Yes, sir. Thank you to our all resource for this, for responding to our participants and for this wonderful interactive session. Now, I would like to invite Mrs. Nisha Bagdas, Assistant Professor, Department of Political Science, for a vote of thanks, to propose vote of thanks.
Didi Nisha is not okay. You can continue.
Okay, so we are at the end of the session. So last but not least, there is the remaining part is to thank all our dignitaries who have given us the time. Who have given us their time, and all the participants who have patiently stayed with us in this whole seminar. So I'd like to thank our principals for motivating us for conducting this seminar. I'd like to thank all our organizing team, Department of Political Science and Department of Sociology. I would also like to thank all our advisory committee, advisory team, and I would like to thank Dr. Binaya Sunda sir, Dr. Binu Sunda sir, and Dr. Tikendra Chetri for giving us their precious time. I would like to thank all our KPGC family, both teaching and non-teaching, for their cooperation. I would like to thank all the participants. I also like to thank Yosna and her husband, Mr. Wong Duplama, for technical assistance. Thank you very much. Now I'll ask
Hello. At the risk, am I audible? Am I audible? Hello, am I audible?
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
sir. Clear. Clear.
Yes, yes, sir. You are, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, so, okay, thank you, sir. At the risk of repetition, I again like to today's speakers, and I personally I have an apology to make to Tikendra Chetri for not mentioning his name in the beginning. I'm sorry, Tikendra. There were some technical issues, and then we're just trying to arrange and organize those, and I forgot your name. I'm sorry for that. I hope you'll agree. You will give me that apology. We have had a very good session. And in the outset, in the beginning, I had said that we have agreed to talk about and deliberate about a theme in which it is very difficult to agree. Thanks for your enlightening speeches. I think we need to carry on the discourse in future also. We'll try to create some platforms, and probably if we are able to create some platform outside the institutional framework, where people can talk freely and frankly. We'll see to it that we'll try to make it possible. Let's cooperate, let's discuss, let's deliberate, because we need to have a good conversation on methodology that we employ in our studies. We need to see our history objectively and revisit our history.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Can I just thank Dakal sir and the entire Kalimpong College team for organizing this. It's been one of the best webinars that I've been to. It's been so interactive, and it's always fun when Tikendra ji is around. Thank you so much, sir. And
Thank you.
Binuda, not bad. Binuda, what do you say? Not bad for gali gali ma paune शिव मन्दिरको गली गलीमा पाउने पिएचडीहरू है नट ब्याड फर गली गलीमा पाउने पिएचडी ब्याड एट अल अब बुझ्नेलाई श्रीखण्ड नबुझ्नेलाई चाहिँ
ठिकै छ मजा आयो फेरि भेटौँला
सर फेरि भेटौँला थ्याङ्क यू
Bye, Bindu. Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Vinayak, ending राम्रो भयो
सक्यो आए
Bye, guys. Bye, everybody. Good night.
Thank you, sir.